Thank you all for being here. The study came out of a response to Act 124 of the 2016 legislative session that directed the Hawaii State Energy Office to conduct a study of alternative utility ownership and regulatory models. We conducted a competitive solicitation procurement through which London Economics International was awarded the contract and conducted that study. And as directed, it looked at those alternative utility ownership and regulatory models through the lens of being able to achieve state energy goals, maximizing consumer cost savings, enabling a competitive distribution system, and eliminating or reducing conflicts of interest amongst stakeholders. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gabriel of London Economics International. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Chris, for this introduction. So my name is Gabriel. I think you've heard the name of my firm a few times, so I won't necessarily repeat it. But I just want to mention that LEI has worked with a few partners in this project, notably Meister Consultants, which is part of the Cadmus group, Booth Clean Energy, and also here our local partner is Yamamoto Kaliboso. So before diving into the analysis and the findings, I just want to give a rough idea of the scope of the study that Chris referred to. So the study itself had us looking into ownership and regulatory models. So what do we mean by this? When we look at ownership models, it's who owns the assets, who owns the generation, who owns the transmission, the distribution, the wires, the infrastructure for the electricity grid. And then the regulatory models, that refers to the set of regulations that frame, among other things, how the utility is allowed to earn revenues, how rates are set, what are the incentives for the utility to achieve some of the state policy objectives. And I also just want to repeat that when we assessed these different models, we did so with regards to 4 policy objectives that were laid in the Act 124, the enabling legislation for this study, which are the ability of each model to help achieve the state energy objectives, notably 100% renewable energy by 2045. Maximize consumer cost savings in doing so, enabling a competitive distribution system, and finally eliminating the conflicts of interest in the planning or procurement of supply or electric supply, if you will. So when we did the analysis, not only did we look at these 4 criteria, we also looked at long-term effects of alternate models with respect to the costs, of course, but what would be the legal regulatory changes that are needed for achieving these alternate models? What would be the impact on distributed energy resources? So we had a whole list of criteria, which I'll get into a bit later. The way we approached the study is that we first started with a wide assortment of potential ownership or regulatory models. We performed a high-level assessment of all of these models on a qualitative basis, looking at the pros and cons of each, feasibility, potential for transition costs, stranded costs, all the while keeping in mind the specifics of the Hawaii electricity industry, notably that it's an island. Well, it's several islands, but I mean, it's not interconnected with any other grid. There's already an IOU operating in some counties. There's already a co-op operating on Kauai. And we also performed community outreaches, and we met various stakeholders who are involved in the various regulatory proceedings here in the state to get the input on what were the priorities of the various stakeholders, what were they looking for in ownership models and regulatory models. So we took all of this in and we ranked these various ownership and regulatory models. So to sort of find which would be the best suited for the state of Hawaii and actually each individual county, because it's important to mention that we looked at the specificities of each county and even each island. For instance, in Maui, we looked at each of the islands that have an electric grid within that county. And once we had ranked these models, we then performed additional analyses on some of the top-ranked models, which I'll get into later, which in the end allowed us to draw conclusions and, being able to present the pros and cons of the status quo with respect to these alternate models. So speaking of outreaches, we visited each of the islands a few times to solicit input from stakeholders. I just want to mention some of the highlights from these outreaches. So of course, we found that the number one priority of stakeholders in the state is to have access to lower electricity rates, but also that they want to be assured that the utility is responsive to community priorities, that the infrastructure be resilient, that there is significant renewable energy in the mix, and of course that new technologies are being integrated into the electric grid. So if we look specifically at ownership models, we started with a list of 8 potential models. The first being the investor-owned utility. That's the current model in 3 counties in the state, in Hawaii County, in Maui County, and in Honolulu County. It's the company that is owned by its investors and has a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. We also looked at different models which would have the utility being acquired by a new parent and be sort of part of a bigger group. We looked at a municipal utility. We look at the co-op model, as is the status quo on Kauai. We looked at a hybrid model where the government would step in and acquire a majority stake in the IOU. And then we look at other models that are a bit more novel in concepts, the first being the IDER, or the Integrated Distributed Energy Resource model. That's a model where the utility adopts a role more as a coordinator of the distribution grid and coordinates different services being offered by suppliers on the distribution grid so that these suppliers can connect directly with consumers. We looked at the model which is called a single buyer, whereupon you would have a new independent entity that would be set up to procure and to plan for power supply. And they would actually contract out or contract for power supply on behalf of the utilities. And then the last model that we looked at is called grid defection. That is certainly not a model that we would aspire to, but it might be an outcome if there is sort of a death spiral where the different consumers get their own power supply in the form of distributed energy and storage and basically stop using the services of the grid. And when I say death spiral, that's because as the grid loses consumers, the cost for whoever cannot afford to get these their own supply of course would go up, because you would have the same costs but distributed on a lower number of consumers. So these are all the models that we looked at a high level. And of course, when we looked at those models, we considered there's 4 policy objectives as illustrated in the left arrow that I mentioned earlier. But we also looked at other criteria in terms of reliability, whether the current legislative framework would allow for such a model, whether there would be changes required, what are the risks, because of course if you change the ownership structure of the utility, there are some risks associated with that. Would there be stranded costs? What would be the impact on the ability of consumers to connect the distribution grid with DERs, distributed energy resources? And finally, making sure that whatever model is in place ensures the financial health of the utility. And as a result of those analysis, we found that there are 4 models that would probably be best suited for the state of Hawaii, which are the IOU, the co-op, and then the single buyer model. And when we consider the single buyer, there are sort of 2 constructs. The first being that there is a ring-fenced division within the utility that acts as a single buyer. And then there is a whole new entity that is completely independent from the utility that could act as a single buyer. So, as I mentioned earlier, we performed additional analyses on these 4 specific models in terms of costs and benefits, the timeline that would be required to transition to these new models, what would be the legal or regulatory changes that would be required to achieve these alternative models. But we also looked at the impact on the utilities' revenue requirements, staffing of the PUC, DER integration, funding mechanisms. And this is, again, a very high-level summary of the major findings. So when we look at a transition in the ownership structure of the assets, so assuming that there is a transaction whereupon someone purchases the assets from the incumbent, the one realization we need to make is that we are not starting from a blank slate. There is already an IOU operating in 3 counties, and there's already a co-op operating on Kauai. These companies are doing well. The assets are not distressed. So if you would want a new entity to come in and purchase the assets, they would need to incentivize the incumbent utility to do so. So there would be a cost to acquiring these assets. Furthermore, there are costs associated with the transaction itself to close the transaction. There's also significant risks associated with the transaction, because if you have a whole new entity coming in, you have management risk and you have cost risk, because you can try and predict what would be the cost, but again, you have significant risk associated with that. We found that in the case of stranded costs, so that's basically the case where a regulated asset, such as a generation asset, becomes less valuable under the new structure. But in the case of a transfer of ownership within the same regulatory framework, the new owner would still be able to recover the cost of these assets under a regulated regime. So there would not necessarily be any stranded costs associated with the transfer in ownership. Based on the past experience that we've seen both in Hawaii or on the mainland, we estimate that any change in the ownership of the infrastructure would take approximately 24 to 36 months to close. And there would not be any changes in legislation or changes in regulations necessary to achieve that transfer. However, whoever wants to purchase the assets would need to demonstrate that the transaction is in the best interest of consumers. So there's definitely a burden of proof upon the new owner to demonstrate that there's a definite benefit for consumers, and that they would be able to demonstrate that they can meet the laws and regulations that are already in place. So that's for a transition, for instance, from IOU to co-op or co-op to IOU. When we looked at the single buyer model, so the incumbent utility remains the owner of the assets, but then you have this new entity, either within or outside of the utility, that would take over the role of planning for future grid expansion or power procurement, and would contract with independent power producers in order to acquire power supply in the future. So when you do that, there are, of course, upfront investments in setting up that new entity, and then you would have recurrent operating costs. There are also, again, risks associated with creating that new entity, especially if it's outside of the utility. And then you would have these independent entity, and the question is, would the savings from that entity purchasing power be enough to offset the fixed cost of running it? This would probably take between 3 to 4 years to set up and have up and running, especially if it's an entity outside of the utility. But you would also require legislative changes and regulation changes to authorize the creation of that new entity and make sure that its responsibilities are well defined and basically work under that new structure. We also did an analysis of what would be the impacts on electric rates between 2018, when we did the analysis, and out to 2045. When we did that analysis, we relied on existing studies, either from KIUC, their capital expenditure plan, or the power supply improvement plan from the HECO companies, which are public documents that have been, for a PSIP, approved by the PUC, and that provides us with a basis to compare what would be the impact of different ownership structures on rates going forward. So as I mentioned earlier, for a transfer in ownership between IOU co-op and co-op to IOU, there would be costs, especially upfront costs to finance the acquisition, that would, generally speaking, offset any benefits in the future. So on average, between now and 2045, the costs, the rates would be higher under the new ownership structure than they would be under the current ownership structure. And you will see variations in between the different counties and islands. That is a function of the current assets owned by the utility, the book value of these assets, the current portfolio of power purchase contracts, and also what are the future plans on retirements, new builds, for future power purchases. What we see is that for the county of Maui, we could see a small reduction in rates with respect to the status quo if there was a change in ownership structure. However, I want to stress that the impact on rates that we did is normalized over time, and that it is one of the criteria that can be looked at in the event of a transaction, but it's certainly not the only one. And as I mentioned earlier, there are significant risks that can be associated with any transaction or change in ownership structure. With respect to the single buyer model, then we see sort of mixed results depending on the county or the island. That also depends on whether any anticipated savings in power procurement can offset the cost of setting up the new entity and actually running the overhead cost of running that new entity. And what we see is that there might be a very slight decrease or increase in cost. Again, these variations are with respect to the status quo. So we're not saying that costs will increase or decrease with respect to current levels in absolute terms. We're just looking at what would be the trajectory of costs under the current regime with respect to alternative models. And what we see is that the single buyer model could or couldn't achieve some savings over time depending on the island or the county. Then we looked at regulatory models. We looked at 6 potential regulatory models, and I want to mention, because it'll be important for later, that these models are not not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first model is the status quo, which is somewhat similar for the HECO companies and KIUC, in the sense that the utilities revenue requirement, which is the basis for electricity rates. So that revenue requirement is mostly based on the cost to provide services. Unfortunately, I should say that the current method, in addition to being a cost of service approach, does integrate, at least for the HECO companies, a few mechanisms from performance-based rate makings, in the sense that currently there are some performance incentive mechanisms in place, earning sharing mechanism, revenue decoupling. So there are some incentives in place, but mostly the cost of service approach does not reward the utility for lowering costs. And so that approach also would tend to incentivize investment on behalf of the utility. The second model that we looked at is the status quo, but with HERA oversight. HERA is the Hawaii Electricity Reliability Administrator. It's an entity that has been authorized by law, but not yet implemented. And its role is envisioned as an enforcer of reliability standards, in the sense that they would have the technical expertise to set and enforce reliability standards, and also open access standards for resources that want to interconnect on the grid. The third one is an independent grid operator, which is modeled on the independent system operators that are currently operating in some jurisdictions on the mainland. So that operator has the responsibility to operate the grid, but also they run markets for the competitive supply on a spot basis, so on an hourly or real-time basis, the procurement of power. In order for that construct to work, you need market depth to ensure competition, and there's also significant complexity associated with setting up these markets, setting up that operation. The fourth model that we looked at is distribution focused. That's a relatively novel concept. There are a few pilot projects on the mainland for that. It's basically a software platform that can be offered either by the utility or a new independent entity that would allow suppliers and consumers on the distribution grid to exchange services. So basically you could have someone who has built solar generation connected to the distribution grid that could be connecting directly with consumers on the distribution grid to sell or purchase supply. You can have storage providers, and basically you would encourage innovation by offering that platform for service providers to connect directly with consumers. The fifth one is performance-based regulation, which is actually a whole spectrum of regulatory mechanism. It's not, one single model. It can range from relatively light PBR, as we have currently in the state of Hawaii for the HECO companies, where there are some performance incentives, some earnings sharing mechanisms, that can go all the way to a full-blown outcomes-based PBR, where the Public Utilities Commission would set objectives for the utility with financial rewards, but the utility would have a wide range of flexibility in how to achieve that outcome, whether it's through operating expenses, capital expenditures, or basically, again, they would have flexibility to achieve these outcomes. And then in the center, you have what we call a conventional PBR approach, where you start with the cost of service, but then you have annual revenue adjustments that can be based on inflation, on productivity. You can have a set of performance incentive mechanisms that sort of align the financial incentives of the IOU with whatever state policy objectives are in the state. And then the last model that we looked at is more specific for co-ops. It's whether it would be worth reducing the regulatory burden on co-ops. We're not necessarily looking at completely exempting co-ops from any regulatory oversight, but the thinking is that since co-ops are owned by the members that they serve, they have intrinsic incentive to work on behalf of their consumers, so that they might be exempted from some PUC oversight requirements. So we performed the same ranking on these regulatory models that we did on the ownership models, again, with respect to the state policy objectives, as shown on the left. Also, these additional criteria on the right, of course, taking into account the unique characteristics of the state of Hawaii. And we came up with 3 potential models for counties served by an IOU, and 3 alternate regulatory models for a Kauai, because again, since a co-op is operating there, the regulatory requirements are slightly different. And so what are these? For Hawaii, Maui, and Honolulu counties, of course, we compared the status quo to 3 alternate models, the first being what we called an outcomes-based PBR. Again, as I mentioned, that model would provide flexibility to the utility. The revenue that the utility can get is driven by the performance incentives. There's not necessarily the same distinction between operating expenditures and capital expenditures as is present right now. The second model that we looked at is sort of a more conventional PBR approach, where you have this annual revenue adjustment mechanism. And we also considered in that model what we call the light implementation of the reliability administrator that would be focused on the integration of distributed energy resources. And lastly, we looked at a hybrid approach where you would have an outcomes-based PBR framework, as in the first model, but then over time you can add an IGO, an independent grid operator, that would come in and operate markets. And when I say markets, I mean operate spot markets for generators to sell their electricity on a wholesale level. And that would take over the planning for the grid. And then you can also have a DSPP, a distribution system platform provider, that again would offer that software platform for sort of a market-based approach to the distribution system. For Kauai County, again, we looked at the status quo and compared it to 3 alternative models. The first one being the full implementation of HERA, where that new entity would take over responsibility for reliability standards and interconnection requirements. But the current regulatory framework would otherwise be untouched. We also looked at an IGO, where again that same independent entity would come in and run markets in the state for the competitive procurement of power on a spot basis, and the co-op would retain the wires assets. And the last one, as I mentioned, is the lighter PUC regulation. And again, when we mention lighter PUC regulation, we do not envision them being completely exempt, because on the US mainland, most co-ops are relatively exempt from any regulatory oversight, but there are differences between Hawaii and the mainland in the sense that most co-ops there are distribution or T&D co-ops, whereas in Kauai or on other islands, you have vertically integrated utilities that own also the generation. Also on the mainland, you have the FERC, which is the federal regulatory agency that has jurisdiction over wholesale markets. So there is some kind of regulatory oversight on the mainland for co-ops that operate or that procure power on a wholesale level, which is why we believe that in Hawaii, the PUC would still need to retain some kind of oversight, for instance, setting boundaries on outcomes, for instance, rate changes or capital investments, so that the utility would have relative flexibility to be able to implement projects, but that if outcomes are outside of preset boundaries, then the PUC would have the authority to step in and look at what's going on. And we also envision the PUC as having sort of an ombudsman role, because if there is absolutely no regulatory oversight, then the co-op becomes sort of a judge and party in the event of any conflict with consumers. So that if there is a conflict and the consumer goes through all of the appeal process and is still not, the outcome is still not satisfactory, there needs to be a higher independent entity that can arbitrage conflicts. So these are the models that we looked at for all the counties. We performed the same additional analyses on these models as I mentioned earlier. So in the case of all 3 PBR options, what we found is that there are some costs associated with transitioning, setting up the new PBR framework, but that there aren't necessarily any significant recurring costs, because PBR might include longer periods in between rate cases, and there's no new entity, there's not necessarily any new staffing requirement. So PBR, again, does not necessarily involve significant costs or risks in the transition. The implementation of PBR can be done on a relatively quick basis, relatively being important here, in the sense that within probably 2 years, a good solid PBR framework can be implemented. Now, if you start adding other constructs, as I mentioned earlier, such as the light HERA, you can do so on a staggered basis, but that would add to your time frame to transition. In the case of the hybrid model, if you want to add an IGO, a grid operator, or a distributed system platform provider, then you could do so over time. As I mentioned earlier, especially in the case of a distribution system platform providers, it's mostly in the pilot project phase in certain jurisdictions. So implementing these constructs on a staggered basis would allow Hawaii to benefit from the experience of the other jurisdictions and tailor that novel concept to the unique characteristics of the state. In terms of legal changes, well, the current legal framework does allow for PBR to be implemented by the PUC, and you are probably all aware that there's an ongoing PBR docket at the PUC. Similarly, the HERA entity is already authorized by law, so it's a matter of implementing it. Now, in the case of the hybrid model, if we were to implement an IGO and DSPP, these entities or these constructs are not currently included in the legislative framework. So there would need to be changes in legislation and in the regulatory framework at the PUC to allow these entities to operate. In the case of KIUC, so again, HERA is already authorized by law, but there would be costs associated with implementing, so upfront costs for setting up the entity and then recurrent costs to operating it. It can be done on a relatively quick basis. Again, if we're assuming that 2 years is a fast time frame. In the case of the IGO, there are significant costs associated with setting up that entity because the new entity would need to be able to operate the grid, but also set up all of the market rules. And again, the question is whether these high overhead costs and complexity risks can be offset by any savings through competitive procurement. And as I mentioned, there would be a need for change in the legislation to enable that construct. Finally, in the case of lighter PUC regulation, then whether there are changes needed or no depends on what you want to do. The current legislative framework allows for the PUC to exempt co-op from certain existing requirements, but the PUC cannot tailor some requirements specifically for co-ops. So if you wanted to set a tailored or regulatory environment specifically for co-ops, then you would need a change in the legislation to give the PUC the authority to do that. We also looked at rates. What would be the impact on rates of going over to these PBR constructs? And what we can observe is that generally speaking, the benefits of moving over to a PBR framework, no matter what the implementation, would generate savings over time. That is because with the PBR framework, you are rewarding the utility for cost efficiency. For instance, there can be a productivity improvement factor built into the annual revenue adjustment mechanism, such that not only is there, there's a potential for cost savings for consumers, but the utility is rewarded for reducing its costs because they can keep or share some of these earnings or avoided costs with the consumers. So again, the utility would be incentivized to be more efficient. You also, through PBR, are able to align the financial incentives of the utility with the state policy objectives. if you want to make sure that distributed energy resources are able to interconnect on the grid, there can be some performance incentive mechanisms that incentivize the utility to make that happen. Similarly, for the penetration of renewable energy generation, there can be some customer-centric PIMs, as has been proposed by the Commission in their order. So you're really able, with PBR, to customize the financial incentives of the utility with your state policy objectives. For KIUC, we also see that notably for our lighter PUC regulation, there would be a relatively modest decrease in rates, but one of the major benefits of moving to that construct, in addition to potentially leading to lower rates, is increasing the flexibility of the co-op to implement new projects or purchase power, or whatever projects they want to implement. They would have added flexibility to do so. In terms of the HERA and IGO models, we see from small to no change in rates. But again, moving over to an IGO, for instance, involves significant complexity, significant risks, so that one must not look only at the potential impact on rates, but look at the big picture, whether it's worth making the change given the potential for savings. We performed some additional analyses in addition to looking at ownership and regulatory models, notably at rate design. So once you have the utilities revenue requirement, how do you translate that into electricity rates? And what we found is that rate design can be complementary to ownership and regulatory models and might help achieve some of the state's policy objectives. But any change to the rate design must be consistent with the overall policy objectives, and that must be done in light of the prevailing ownership and regulatory models. So you can't achieve your policy objectives by rate design alone, but that can be a factor in helping achieve the state policy objectives. We also evaluated the management of the state's electricity sector with each county operating independently versus a multi-county approach. And that was a very high-level evaluation, and generally speaking, we found that in theory, the multi-county model would be better suited to helping meet the state's energy goals, maximize consumers' cost savings, and enabling a competitive distribution system. So that was a long-winded way to get to the key takeaways. So if we looked at all three counties that are under operating with an IOU utility, so Hawaii, Maui, and Honolulu counties, we observed that the current ownership and regulatory framework has been successful at providing reliable electricity service, but that there is definitely an evolving technological and policy landscape, and in that context, there is a need for regulatory adjustments. Why are we saying regulatory adjustments? And it's because, according to our findings in terms both of costs and risks, these costs and risks of changing the ownership structure do not necessarily address the number one concern of stakeholders, which is the lowering of electricity risks, electricity costs. And also, as I said, it involves significant risk. Plus, most of the benefits that can be achieved through a change in ownership structure can also be achieved through a change in the regulatory framework by aligning the incentives of the utility with the state policy objectives. Which is why we think that regulatory changes have a better likelihood of helping achieve the state policy objectives. And generally speaking, moving to a PBR framework, the benefits of doing so would outweigh the costs. Finally, we want to point out that the PBR framework is built with different building blocks, so it's not necessarily you don't necessarily need to move to a full PBR implementation in year one. That can be done on a staggered basis with, for instance, making sure that you have a solid PBR framework in place and then adding some performance incentive mechanisms or adjusting as you go to make sure that you have solid foundation. And then you can also add some different building blocks. For instance, distribution system platform provider that could help meet the state policy objectives of having a competitive distribution system. For Kauai County, well, first of all, we have the same observation that the current framework has ensured reliable service, but the co-op is operating in the same evolving landscape with new technology. The cost for some resources that are falling dramatically. There are some changes in policies such that there is a need, in our opinion, to adjust the regulatory structure. Again, a change in ownership in Kauai would not necessarily lower electricity rates. Actually, it might increase electricity rates again because of that transaction. And which is why a lighter oversight by the PUC for co-ops could help reduce rates and increase flexibility, as I mentioned earlier. But there's still a need for a safety net with the PUC retaining some oversight capability. The HERA could be a vehicle to provide arbitration services, and again, it could also step in to provide reliability standards by concentrating the technical expertise within that entity. So that's it for my presentation. I, of course, want to point out that this is a very, very high-level summary of the analysis that we did. It is a summary of our final report, which is posted on the Hawaii State Energy Office website. The final report itself is based on more than 40 individual tasks that we performed in terms of qualitative or quantitative analyses. And I will now take questions if anyone has questions on our analysis or findings. Yeah.
Maybe I missed this, but in your analysis on the alternative ownership structure and the rate impact.
Could you hold for the question while we get your mic so we can capture it on the website? Hello. Hi. So on the alternative ownership structure, and you're showing the rate impacts. Perhaps I missed this, but was the assumption that the state was going to 100% renewable?
Yes, for all of these cases, we assume that the state is moving towards 100% by 2045 for renewable energy. So all of these cases were under similar assumptions. We just looked at the ownership structure, the financing costs, and the differences in operation between these different owners.
When you said 100% in 2045, are you talking about the law, RPS, or 100% real renewables? And if you're talking about 100% real renewables, do you mean low climate impact ones or any renewable?
So in order to have an impartial analysis, we relied on public documents. For the HECO companies, they have the PSIP, which lays down a path towards 100% renewable. So we use the capital expenditure plan from that document.
Isn't that document RPS?
Sorry?
Isn't their PSIP based on the 100% RPS?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the difference, but yeah, 100% renewable energy by 2045.
HECO explained how the grid could be 35% renewable and have an RPS of 115% in answer to one of our IRs. So I was wondering if you could distinguish between the two or not.
not to put Scott on the spot, but do you want to respond to that?
Mhm.
So our RPS plan or our PSIP plans assume that we will be getting off of fossil fuel by 2045. What was your second?
100% low climate impact renewables or any renewables?
At this point, it's just any renewables. It's non-fossil fuel.
Chris, I'm glad we're able to get your exercise for you today. I perhaps maybe don't fully understand the single buyer concept. I assume it's similar to like a system operator or sort of a, independently making the choices of where things are procured. And assuming my assumption is correct, or if you can clarify that, could you go into what the costs are? It would seem like those functions are already performed either within the utility or not. And if you're to create a new entity, for example, those jobs would be somewhat fungible. Maybe there'd be some increase in cost, but I guess I'm a little, I would love to hear more clarity specifically in what the comparison costs would be. Thank you.
Sure. So the single buyer basically is not responsible for operating the grid, but they would look at future power needs and contract for power in the future. So they could run a competitive solicitation where independent power producers would be able to compete. The IOU could also provide some project through an unregulated subsidiary, but basically the utility would not necessarily be setting the parameters of the power procurement RFP. And so that new entity would be responsible for setting the parameters of the RFP, the parameters of that new power asset that they're looking for, and actually contract for that power on behalf of the utility. So yes, the utility is currently doing that, but of course, if you want to ring fence it within the utility, you would have some additional costs. But the problem with that is the perception. So it's hard to convince the public that even within the utility, the entity can be fully independent. So what we've seen in other jurisdictions is that could be sort of a transition before having a fully independent entity that does that job. And of course, when you talk a new fully independent entity, then you won't necessarily have the same cost savings and synergies as if you had that planning within the utility, because of course the utility still needs to retain some of the technical expertise related to that. And then you have this new independent entity that will be set up with their own IT infrastructure, their own space requirements, their own technical expertise. So that does add some overhead costs.
Thanks for giving your presentation. I actually kind of wanted to dive a little into a figure 26 on page 70 of the report. This is the 186-page report. This has to do with indicative acquisition and transition costs to a co-op model. Looks like you guys are assuming about $4.5 billion to acquire, establish a co-op, and then transition and train staff between HECO, HELCO, and MECO total costs. Can you talk a little bit about those underlying assumptions? That there's a footnote under here where you look at 9 previous acquisitions and the EBTA. Can you look at a little bit how you got to those assumptions and how you use them, and then how those costs translate into looking at the recommendations that you made?
Sure. So I can't speak to actual numbers because I don't remember them off the top of my head, but that final report is based on the individual task reports. And so if you dive into the one task report that's specifically about the revenue requirement of transitioning the assets, you'll have all the numbers. So basically what we did is value each of the individual companies within HECO, so well, HECO, MECO, and HELCO. So we use standard valuation methods, which can include looking at comparable transactions, or looking at the book value, or looking at the the stock, the stock value of these companies, and we came up with a valuation for these companies. And when we assume the transition, for instance, from IOU to co-op, we assume that the co-op would finance that acquisition with 100% debt and would pay a 10% premium to shareholders in order to incentivize them to acquire the assets. When translating that into rates, then of course the co-op operates under what's called a tier model, in the sense that they need to show that their revenues are a certain ratio with respect to the interest payment, so that we were able to calculate the interest payment for the new entity that would acquire these assets, and applying that ratio would give us an idea of the revenue requirement that the new entity would need to recover from ratepayers, and then translate that into rates. Well, again, it's based on looking at comparables or what has been offered historically by companies looking to acquire other assets.
You looked at the next era from here too?
Yeah, we looked at comparables. We also did look at what happened in the Nextera case. But again, all of the assumptions on these comparables that we looked at are laid out in the individual task report.
I'm curious to know if there was any discussions on your community involvement regarding resources that would be supplied by, as an example, geothermal resources. If in the future distribution via undersea cable would occur, and the counties would be independently on their own with regards to distribution, how would the negotiations be resolved with regards to the distribution? Who would pay for it, as well as the impacts?
Mm-hmm. That we did not specifically look at these factors, because when there's a technical analysis involved, that was outside the scope of this study. So again, we based our study on the technical analysis that has been performed by the utilities themselves and approved mostly by the PUC, and we use that as a base of comparison between the different ownership or regulatory models. But we did not perform any specific cost analysis with respect to having all of the islands operating with one another.
Hello. Hey, on the slide that looked at the impacts of regulatory changes, you separated the KIUC and HECO companies into two different buckets. Would the changes made to with PBRs to positively affect the rates for HECO companies? Did you assess whether there would be any incidental effects on KIUC rates?
So KIUC is specifically excluded from the PBR proceeding.
Okay.
So we assume the PBR framework, we looked at the PBR framework for the HECO companies, but for KIUC, we looked at a different set of regulatory models. So we didn't see any impact from the PBR on the HECO companies that would affect KIUC.
Got it. Thank you.
Could you go back to that slide where, that you had on rates, the effect on rates, please?
Of ownership or regular?
On ownership, right.
Ownership.
Is that the one? Yeah. So under a single buyer, you have savings for Oahu and Maui, but not for any of the other islands. Is that because there's economies of scale? Is that what's driving the savings for the larger islands with greater customer base?
Well, that is certainly one factor that could be impacting the results, but also there's when we look out at rates out to 2045, we need to take into consideration what's the retirement schedule for existing assets, what's the future need for purchased power, because basically the more power you need to purchase in the future with respect to the power that's provided by the assets that you have currently, the more benefits you'll get from a single buyer.
And where are the principal savings coming from under that single buyer model?
So we are assuming in that study that an independent entity that sets the parameters for an RFP would be able to have a more competitive outcome than if the utility itself runs the RFP. And we assumed a 3 to 5% improvement in power purchase cost. That is based on some studies that we have reviewed about the outcome of competitive procurement.
Thanks, Chris. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is your single buyer model essentially an ISO? And if it is an ISO, then you're talking about another regulatory operational structure on top of the system, which is fine. But then it raises the question of, given, following the previous comment, given the fact that it's islands and Maui and Oahu are, in a sense, the most developed in terms of DER and generation and all those sorts of things. Did you, if it is supposed to be an ISO, did you consider comparing California before the California ISO and afterwards, and whether or not there was a cost savings of the kind that you presumed to exist in your Hawaii analysis?
Sorry, so the single buyer model is different from the ISO because the ISO, well, first of all, operates the grid, whereas a single buyer would not be operating the grid. And also an ISO operates spot market. So basically each hour or on a 5-minute basis, they have all of the generators offering their energy and basically selecting on a dynamic basis who has a better price and who will run. In order for that construct to provide significant savings, you need, of course, market depth. You need sufficient resources to be able to participate in that market. And that is a viable concept on the US mainland where you have much larger load and many more resources and different types of resources, and all of the grids are interconnected together. What we found is that for Hawaii, considering the size of the market and the overhead associated with establishing these markets, you would probably not achieve significant savings just because you don't have the scale or the market depth that you have on the US mainland.
So to follow up, what you're saying then is somebody else would own the whole transmission system as well as somebody else would own the transmission and distribution system, and perhaps somebody's else would own and operate the generation resources, but your single buyer would simply be well, not simply, but would be basically a coordinating agency? And if so, where else does that exist? And what are its comparative before and after cost savings analyses?
Sure. So the ISO, in the ISO construct, the utility needs to divest its generation assets, and the wire assets, transmission and distribution, remain under a regulated regime, but all of the generation assets become unregulated and earn their revenues from the markets, their revenues. And so yes, you would have an independent entity that operates the markets, and the utility is confined to the owning the infrastructure, wires infrastructure. Under a single buyer construct, the utility owns and operates the wires assets. They may maintain their existing generation assets, but for all future power procurement needs, that new independent entity will evaluate, well, first of all, the need for new power. They will evaluate what type of power do they want. Do they want to go renewable? Do they want intermittent? Do they want even storage? And that new entity will set the parameters of what they're looking for and contract for it on behalf of the utility. That's a model that's used elsewhere. For instance, in Illinois, there's the Illinois Power Agency that is responsible for procuring power. You have also in Ontario, Canada, OPA, the Ontario Power Agency. Sorry, I have a blank, OPA. And you have also worldwide, for instance, in Malaysia, they recently established a single buyer, and that's where they sort of transition to a single buyer within the utility, and then eventually they'll transition to a single buyer outside of the utility. That being said, it's hard to impossible to look at, you know, what are the outcomes before and after, just because the type of energy that's being procured right now is evolving. So in the past, you might have had coal or some form of oil, natural gas resources, whereas now they're procuring more and more wind. The costs are changing, so it's very hard to do a study of, you know, the before and after. But that being said, there are definitely studies that show that an independent entity being able to procure power on a competitive basis would help achieve some of savings. Now, I will concede that 3 to 5% number is, you know, might not be the actual outcome, but it is the assumption that we saw in the literature and that we use in this study.
Okay, maybe one last comment on this. It seems to me that the scenario that you described, I won't call it a model yet, but the scenario that you described is essentially what the HECO companies are being pushed toward by what the PUC is trying to do now, and what also the legislature has encouraged from the side. If you take what's happening now to its logical extension and within the context of the PUC's inclinations white paper.
Mm-hmm.
That was a comment if you want to turn it to a question.
As we move to a future where we're looking at both resources and non-wire alternatives, have you looked at how each of these models would be impacted analyzing non-wire alternatives? For example, the separate buyer.
Yes, we definitely did look at the impact that each model could have on, for instance, distributed energy resources. And our overarching conclusion is that you can have some benefits by changing the ownership structure, for instance, from IOU to co-op, where the co-op could move to add DERs. But in our analysis, what we see is that moving or changing to a regulatory construct that incentivizes or that aligns the financial incentives of the utility with the state policy objectives. So if you incentivize or you reward the utility for increasing the number of DER interconnections, then you could achieve pretty much the same outcomes as if you were to change the ownership model at a lower risk, because you're not changing the whole ownership structure and setting up a new entity to operate the assets.
So did the closure of the geothermal plant kind of affect the data or projections or anything like that?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I guess what's important to remember for this study is that we use a projection in the future for capital expenditures and investments required, and then we compared all of the different models with respect to that sort of plan. So I guess what's important is that we compare all of the models on a similar basis. Now, of course, the plan in the future is going to change. The closure of the geothermal plant is one example, but of course there is one guarantee, it's that whatever you forecast, you'll be wrong in terms of absolute levels. But since we're looking at a relative level, the confidence is higher because we're evaluating everyone with respect to the same basis. And we're just looking at, with that similar set of assumptions, what are the changes that would be brought by a new ownership or new regulatory models, and how would that impact rates, but also the risk and all of the other things that we looked at in terms of impact on regulatory requirements or integration of distributed resources, legal, technical feasibility.
So we talked a little bit about 2045 RPS earlier, and it looks like when you read the report, and this is an assumption I'm making about it, but it looks like the hybrid model seems to produce the most benefit across a variety of criteria that you guys have used to assume it. My question to you is, doing all the research, and it looks like you just looked at a 2045, if we were to switch a utility ownership model, is there a possibility, or maybe you can kind of comment on whether the RPS would be accelerated by the new owner and whether this would produce costs or savings, especially under a hybrid model that seems to be the most beneficial?
Did you mean ownership or regulatory models?
Either or. So
okay.
Under the hybrid, I guess that's a regulatory.
So again, so we looked at a future where the utilities would be able to achieve the RPS by the target that's been set. That being said, it's not impossible that, for instance, through a change in regulation and incentivizing the various utilities to achieve some targets, that they would be able to achieve these targets earlier because they can share the savings with consumers, or they are financially incentivized to achieve these targets. So again, that would be the difference between the current cost of service approach, where they need to meet these targets because that's the law, and a PBR approach, where the utilities would have a financial reward for achieving those targets. And depending how the PBR framework is set up, and the various incentives that are being contemplated in terms of performance incentives, then there might be incentives for the utilities to achieve these targets earlier. But again, it depends on how the PBR framework is implemented.
Do you mind switching to the key takeaways slide? At the bottom, you've bolded and italicized staggered basis. Did you model implementation of different aspects of PBR going in under different periods of time to sort of support the staggered concept? And if so, what were the recommended things that you would say that should go into place first?
Well, yeah, so basically we modeled different constructs of PBR. For instance, in the case of the hybrid model, which use an outcomes-based PBR, that's mostly driven by performance incentive mechanisms. So you have an expanded set of PIMs that set targets, and then the utility basically has flexibility in how to achieve these targets. So in our assumptions, we sort of add these on again, a staggered basis. I guess where this would be applied the most is if, for instance, we take a model that has a DSPP, the distribution system platform provider, that construct is added over time once you have the PBR framework in place, because there are some relatively high costs associated with that construct. And that would also allow the utilities to take into account the experience of other jurisdictions. But yes, so in our modeling, we did assume sort of a staggered implementation, notably of the more complex models.
So, I mean, just to follow up, it seems like you referenced the creation of a distribution DSIP. Were you looking at like sort of transformations of what the PIMs would be over time, for example, like starting out being asymmetrical and becoming more symmetrical over time? Or I think you'd referenced the impacts to credit, for example, as one of the costs. Were you trying to analyze how to minimize that type of cost over time?
No, so basically we added some of the building blocks of PBR over time, but we did not adjust these PIMs once they were in place. But that's a very good comment, and something that's inherent to a PBR mechanism, that you need to have a good solid foundation in place, but you won't necessarily get everything done the first time around, or you won't necessarily get it exactly right the first time around. So that's why you have these adjustments where you can sort of review has it worked, and you can adjust the magnitude of the incentives or the rewards or the penalties, whether you want to make them symmetrical or not. And so you can definitely adjust that depending on whether your mechanism has been able to achieve the outcomes you're looking for.
I guess an additional follow-up, or maybe a different direction. You focused on the number one priority, which was reducing costs. Did you do any analysis of looking at some of the other priorities to see if there's significant changes, say, for example, to resiliency under different models, just to be able to check to see if there's maybe other impacts?
Mm-hmm. So just to make sure that I conveyed the results accurately. So we mentioned cost being the number one concern of stakeholders, but our findings are not solely based on costs. We looked at, again, the risk associated both with the implementation of the alternative method itself, but for instance, any legal risks, any risk associated with people contesting whatever change is going on. So, you know, we mentioned that the cost here, because it has been identified as the priority for stakeholders, but cost is really not the only factor that we considered in looking at those. The best example I can give you is that in the case of a transfer in ownership, we can try to evaluate the cost associated with that transfer, but there are still significant risks in the sense that costs can be higher than expected. So our normalized calculation of rates over time shows one scenario, but we also need to look at, you know, what's the risk for those costs to be much higher than they would be.
Hi, Gabriel. You mentioned, I think it might be on the prior slide or something, where you looked at a multi-county model versus single county. And I think the multi-county had greater, ability to meet state energy goals, maximize cost savings. Can you just give a little bit more detail about what is a multi-county model, or how did you folks frame that?
So that is one task where we were asked to look on a qualitative basis what would be the differences in operating or having the counties being operated together, in the sense that you would have one or more entities but able to share in the resources between the various islands, and whether you would be able to achieve cost savings by operating all of the islands, on an integrated basis. And again, I want to state that this is purely from a theoretical perspective. We didn't do any analysis or cost-benefit analysis. We looked at, in theory, would you have advantages in operating all of the counties in an integrated basis? And basically what we discuss here is that being able to share the resources among the islands would allow, presumably, the state to reach its energy goals in a more efficient manner. You might be able to be more efficient cost-wise by sharing these resources, and for having a competitive distribution system, then it might be easier if you're, again, able to share. But we didn't look at what's the actual cost of laying a cable between two islands, and would that offset the benefits? We just looked at it from a theoretical perspective, because that was really not the main point or the main scope of this analysis.
Gabriel, I think there are some questions about the scope of the project. So maybe if you look at slide 4, it tells you the legislative intent, and you might discuss some of that to answer some of the questions on scope. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically, just to reiterate that this main focus of this study was to look at alternative utility ownership and regulatory models, which is what we concentrated most of our analyses on. And one of the tasks asked us to do, for instance, look at rates. Would rate making be an efficient way to achieve the state energy goals? And we had the findings that I discussed earlier, that it can be complementary to whatever ownership or regulatory models in place. Same thing for the single versus multi-county model. But the scope is really to look at the ownership and regulatory, the state set of regulations that govern the sector.
So great job. Thank you, Carolyn, for bringing us back to the scope. I think that's important. Since there's no one silver bullet, right? And so I guess my question is with regard to maybe an earlier question about, what happens if the geothermal plant goes down, or so sensitivity analysis, particularly with regard to generation and the assumptions that you used on which generation assets will be retired, and then what is going to replace those generation assets. Was there any sort of sensitivity analysis that was done based on your analysis to say, let's say wind gets taken off the table for whatever reason, regulatory or so on and so forth? Does that change the economics, and how much would that change the economics and your results, I guess?
Yeah, so we do have some sensitivity analyses which are laid out in one of the task reports. And so, of course, if you change the scenario, you might have different results in terms of the impact on the rates. However, what we found was that, first of all, the impact is not significant and does not necessarily change our major conclusions. And again, I guess that our key takeaways are based on the impact on the rates, but not just that. We looked at everything else that's involved in changing the ownership model, and we're saying that, just tweaking, well, not tweaking, but adjusting the regulatory framework is probably a better way to reduce risk and align the policy of the state policy objectives with the utility incentives.
What would you say is the major thing that you're recommending that the PUC and the legislature are not doing?
So technically, we're not recommending anything. We are, showing these findings, and this study has been commissioned by the legislature, and we are showing the legislature the pros and cons of the various constructs and the findings that we have. And then it will be up to the legislature to decide how they want to go forward, given the pros and cons that we've laid out in this report.
Let me rephrase. What is the major finding of your report that is not being done by the PUC today?
So I guess if we're looking at the HECO companies, we show the pros and cons of various PBR constructs. Of course, the PUC has gone ahead with one construct that I can qualify, that we call the conventional PBR approach. And our opinion is that it's a very well-balanced order and it's a good way forward. But again, in looking at the various state energy goals, for instance, one of them being a competitive distribution system, in our analysis, we did consider, well, in the future, what you could do is look at the DSPP construct that could help, achieve these objectives. But again, the PUC has come out with one specific construct, which is one of the constructs we did look at, but we did look at different implementations of PBR and different building blocks that can be added also to that PBR framework to meet the state policy objectives as laid out in the legislation.
Thanks, Chris. You're going to lose more weight. Thank you. I play the role as the devil's advocate. Just to follow up on Henry's question, as well as maybe in the back of all of our minds going forward, and you indicate conducting a long-term cost-benefit analysis. I see several things. If we're going to have the counties on an independent structure and dissolve what we have currently, I think it'll bring chaos to the PUC and its regulations. Certainly, it'll be sort of a big change. That'll take time. Secondly, I think we also need to do the pros and cons analysis. As an example, because we're an island state structure, unlike the mainland, where anything can happen from state to state. There is a cooperative effort presently. It's difficult for our island structure. As an example, in terms of disasters. And I come from the Big Island, and we've experienced hurricane disasters recently. As an example, Hurricane Isel that affected the Puna district. And I'd say if under the current ownership of our utility structure, that's the best model that we've ever seen. Cooperation with manpower, investment, financial commitment, you have one say. And the cooperation with the utilities in getting staffing, equipment to the Big Island was one of immediate decision-making. And we did not see that in Puerto Rico. They were left alone. So the impacts of disasters. And as a member of the Climate Change Commission as well, and I know Henry is very involved with it, so we're looking at climate change. So if we have individual structures in each counties, I think that will also need to be considered in pros and cons. And so I think going forward, from what we learned today, which is, you did a good job, by the way, and I'm pleased with that. So the next step for us, I believe, will then be the pros and cons and more current, up-to-date, talking about distribution of potential new resources like geothermal or what happens, just to give an idea what we can look forward to going into the future, as well as impacts on PUC, as I mentioned again, and the differences between the current model we have versus the different structures that we've seen today. So I think there's a lot of work to do. So perhaps taking on this next study, which hopefully will not take too long, and have a good cooperative community involvement with this, as well as you did earlier, and the information that could come out from those here today as well. And that also would include the comment that was presented earlier by Henry Curtis. Thank you.
Co-ops generally don't have to pay profits or distribute dividends. How did you calculate the savings that would occur in a co-op, and is that just reinvested capital? And if so, how do you calculate that?
Yeah, so basically we use some of the parameters that are being used by KIUC in Kauai, in the sense that all of the acquisition is debt, based on debt, and we also target a debt to equity rate, well, not a ratio, but basically we target 70% indebtedness for the utility with 30% of capital. So any earnings or retained earnings, in addition to that 30% capital value, is assumed to be returned to the consumers.
I just want to follow up. If you don't return that to consumers and use that to accelerate your reduction of your debt, doesn't that change your return on investment and make it more competitive?
Well, yes, so if you change the financial parameters, you will presumably affect your revenue requirement, yes.
It looked like the analysis of co-ops was done on a county-by-county basis. Did you look at a statewide co-op model?
No, we did not look at a statewide model. So we looked at what's currently in place, and we assumed that co-ops could be set up in each county. But we did not look at a statewide co-op or a statewide IOU. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank everyone for coming in today.